What is folk horror? We all know it's got something to do with rural locations, creepy cults, and ritual sacrifices, right?
Oh God! Oh Jesus Christ!
When it comes to subgenres, folk horror might be the most difficult one to define. We all know what a slasher is. There are rules, formulas, structures in place. The same goes for haunted house films and zombie movies. But folk horror? It's a much trickier and more slippery beast. Folk horror is a mood, an aesthetic, a sound. But if you dig a little deeper, there's much more to folk horror than what's on the surface. Sometimes we as human beings have a tendency to look back fondly and romanticize our history. But let's be honest, wherever you're from, most of your country's history will tend to be filled with war, pain, injustice, persecution, and death. If we were to step back in time into our country's past, it wouldn't be quaint, charming, and picture perfect. It would be terrifying. Folk horror taps into the horror of our history, the fear of the old ways of life, old customs and beliefs, before the creature comforts of modernity and civilization existed. But where did this subgenre begin, and where did the term folk horror even come from? According to Kevin Lyons and the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television, the first movie to be labelled folk horror was a strange little film from 1970 called The Blood on Satan's Claw. The story is set in 18th century England about a mysterious corpse which is accidentally uncovered and causes the young teenage residents of this village to start acting very strangely. When the film was still in production, a reporter from a British trade journal, Keen Weekly, filed a little report on the film under the headline Folk Horror Study from Hemdale and Chiltern. This was, that we know of, the earliest use of this term. So it could be argued that Blood on Satan's Claw is the original folk horror. But this term really came into common vernacular just a few years ago, when it was used by Mark Gatiss in his brilliant documentary, A History of Horror.
Amongst these are a loose collection of films which we might call folk horror. They shared a common obsession with the British landscape, its folklore and superstitions.
In his documentary, Gatiss applies the term folk horror to three particular horror movies that were made in this era. One of them was the aforementioned Blood on Satan's Claw. Another was an earlier film, Witchfinder General from 1968. And the third and final one was The Wicker Man from 1973. These films have now often been grouped together and labelled the unholy trinity, the original three folk horror movies. What's interesting and kind of problematic about this, though, is that these three films are actually so incredibly different.
The year is 1645. England is in the grip of bloody civil war.
Witchfinder General is a historical film telling the true story of Matthew Hopkins, who exploited women and families during the English Civil War and burned hundreds of women at the stake for being witches. It's a grim, nihilistic film with a cold outlook on humanity, and at times it doesn't even feel so much like a horror as it does some kind of historical drama.
By the way, do you know what they call me now?
What?
Witchfinder General. There are those who think that I should be appointed such for all of England.
Hail, behemoth spirit of the dark, take down my
Blood on Satan's Claw is more like a fairy tale. This is a supernatural story about children becoming minions of the devil himself. Much more traditional horror, the film includes demons and skeletons, not to mention some very disturbing ritualistic rape scenes. Then, of course, there's The Wicker Man, an entirely different beast altogether. This is a quirky, offbeat horror film which, for the bulk of it, doesn't even feel like a horror film, about a Christian policeman who travels to a little island called Summer Isle, which just happens to be run by a strange pagan cult, and eventually ends up being burnt alive. Narratively, these films really have no similarities whatsoever. One is supernatural, the other two aren't. One is based on historical fact, the other two aren't. But these films do share stylistic similarities. What sets them apart visually from many other horror films being made at the time is that these weren't filmed in studios. They're all shot on locations, using the British countryside to enhance the horror. None of these films really take place on dark and stormy nights or in the London fog. They all take place in rural locations and usually in stark daylight. There's something inherently earthy about these films, as if the celluloid itself was dug up from the soil. So, other than the fact that they are all set and shot on the British countryside, how else can we define folk horror? Well, in my opinion, the best definition of this subgenre was coined by folk horror scholar Adam Scoville. In his brilliant book, Folk Horror, Hours Dreadful and Things Strange, Adam explored not just these three films, but a whole array of other British movies and TV shows from the era which had a similar kind of vibe. Eventually, he came up with a fascinating method to define folk horror, something he called the folk horror chain. The folk horror chain consists of 4 rules or links, and each link leads to the next. Link number 1 is a rural location. All of these movies are set in the countryside. Emphasis on the landscape itself is important to the story as much as it is to the style. Our rural location leads us to link number 2, isolated groups. Most characters that inhabit a folk horror are cut off from urban, modern civilization. In Blood on Satan's Claw, this little story takes place entirely within this small community. There's this feeling of characters being trapped in this situation. They can't simply escape and go somewhere else. Even the way the film's directed, look at how trees and branches actually create a kind of frame around these shots. It really makes the story feel as if it's contained in this isolated location. And so, in the folk horror chain, isolation inevitably leads to link number 3, skewed morals or beliefs. In being cut off from society, characters in folk horror live differently to the rest of us. There's a sense of lawlessness, of entirely alien traditions and customs. In folk horror, characters might believe that children of the village are possessed by devils simply for being sexually active. They might believe that women who think and act independently must be witches. Or they might believe that dancing naked outside or sacrificing people in giant effigies could help them grow their apples.
Accept our sacrifice and make our blossoms fruit.
This, of course, leads us nicely to link number 4, supernatural or violent happenings. The skewed moral beliefs of characters in folk horror result in pretty horrific consequences. Murder, rape, ritual sacrifice. Folk horrors have pretty nasty final acts. They never end particularly well.
You took him from me! You took him from me!
So, Adam Scoville's folk horror chain is, in my opinion, the best way to define a folk horror. And what's great fun about it is that we're then able to look beyond the traditional films that everyone agrees are folk horror and apply this chain to other movies from around the world. Surely not all folk horror has to be British. Let's look outside of the UK for a moment. What about over in Sweden? Let's look at the work of Ingmar Bergman. What is The Virgin Spring if not a folk horror? Rural location, villagers cut off from society, very particular customs and beliefs, and of course, violent happenings. Meanwhile, over in Japan, we have movies like Onibaba, a mother and daughter living in a rural village cut off from society who start believing in supernatural happenings and soon meet their end. Even over in Australia, there's been a huge tradition of rural horror movies that use the country's history and locations to create sheer, uncanny terror. Then, of course, there's America, a country that's so new and modern, surely folk horror can't exist over there. America don't have as much traditional folk horror in the way that Britain or Australia do. However, I would argue that subgenres such as Southern Gothic share many similarities with folk horror. Look at The Night of the Hunter, one of my personal favourite movies. This is a rural set horror movie about characters living in the deep south. A pious, immoral Christian rocks up in this town, skews the morals and beliefs of all the villagers, and of course, violent happenings occur. There's also a huge emphasis on the natural world in this film, not to mention the importance of the music. What's perhaps interesting is that nearly all of these films we've mentioned so far are period set, but what if we looked at something that was, at the time, a little more contemporary?
Hello, Amy.
Hello, Charlie.
Straw Dogs. What a grim and disturbing movie this is, and it pretty much exactly fits the folk horror mould. Sam Peckinpah's movie tells the story of an urban outsider, played by Dustin Hoffman, who moves with his girlfriend to a rural village in Cornwall, and of course, the pair are not welcomed by the locals.
God damn you! Move!
Similarly, over in the US, Deliverance told the story of three arrogant urban city boys heading to the deep south for a canoeing trip and finding themselves a little out of their depth.
He got a little pretty mouth, ain't he?
Deliverance belongs to a particular American subgenre which I believe is inextricably linked to folk horror, and that's what's known as hicksploitation. These are usually stories set in the deep south of America, usually about ignorant urban visitors stumbling into a town they don't understand and being harassed and often killed by the locals. Speaking of hicksploitation, here's a controversial opinion. I would argue that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is also a kind of folk horror. Let's take a closer look. A group of arrogant youngsters rock up into a little rural backwoods town in Texas. This town is isolated from the rest of civilization. Because of this, the inhabitants of this town like to do things the old way. The employees of the slaughterhouse are not really interested in using modern machinery, they prefer a nice sledgehammer.
Sledge! See, that was better. They died better that way.
And of course, these arrogant city folks end up wandering into the wrong house, messing with the wrong people, and violent happenings occur. This movie ticks all four links in the folk horror chain, and I would say that even stylistically, the film fits the folk horror mould way more than it does a slasher. Look at the cinematography here, the emphasis on the landscape, the bright orange sun, the folk music on the soundtrack, the ritualistic way in which bodies and bones seem to be arranged, and of course, so much of the horror itself happens in stark daylight. Moving into the 21st century, perhaps the filmmaker most renowned for bringing folk horror back to the mainstream is Ben Wheatley. He made a trilogy of films that in some way feel like a modern-day unholy trinity: Kill List, Sightseers, and A Field in England, all three of which explore superstitions, strange ways of life, cults, and the dangers of the British countryside. Right now, we seem to be in a kind of folk horror revival. Take a look back at some of the most successful horror movies of this last decade: Ari Aster's Midsommar, Robert Eggers' The Witch. Even Jordan Peele's Get Out has a kind of folk horror style and aesthetic. An urban outsider travels to a rural location and is not treated kindly by the locals.
Sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
But what is it that makes folk horror films so frightening? For me, it's the way in which it takes such a cold and distant look at humanity. These films aren't about monsters or vampires or demons. They don't usually give us a traditional hero or final girl. Instead, they take quite a cold and distant look at people. People with all their strange beliefs and ways of life. No one comes off looking particularly great in folk horror. Even the quote-unquote good guys are usually pretty unlikable. They're arrogant and they're disrespectful. Who are we really supposed to be rooting for in The Wicker Man? What's the scariest thing about Robert Eggers' The Witch? Is it the witch itself? Or is it the way in which these human beings treat each other in this puritanical society? Oh my God, what the fuck is that? And what's really frightening about the Blair Witch Project? Remember, we don't ever actually see a wicked witch. Instead, we see 3 human beings ready to turn on each other as soon as the countryside gets the better of them. Folk horror reminds us that in comparison to this natural, ancient world in which we live, we're all kind of small and insignificant. We're surrounded by something bigger, older, and more powerful than us. If we strip away our mobile phones, our cars, our computers, our modern ways of life, we're little more than animals. We're a world that's steeped in dark, macabre history, and that history is all around us, right beneath our feet, hidden in the soil. Looking for more horror content? Subscribe now for more videos like this one and listen to the Evolution of Horror podcast. Head on over to evolutionofhorror.com.